Hello, everyone from Rhinebeck, New York, where it's about 30 degrees and snow on the ground. And I have a presentation that I'm very grateful from Marissa Epps for putting this together, 30 slides. And I'll just start. It goes, and by the way, I couldn't do the whole time. I'm stopping in 1993, but this is 1944. This is my father. This is where it starts, of course, with your parents. My father was a paratrooper, and he was in the 104th First Airborne Division. He jumped 64 times, and he was an instructor. And during the war, he gave jump shows across the country to sell war bonds. And finally, in 1945, he was on a mission from San Diego to invade Japan. And that was the same time, August 6, 1945, the bomb was dropped. So my dad then was on an occupation assignment in 1946. And he came back to Manchester, where I was born, and he brought back Japanese lacquerware, bowls, trays, kimono, wood platform shoes, two-toed white socks. So for when I was a child, Japan was a mystery. In fact, that was my mind, kind of moved more toward Japan. My parents were married for 66 years, and I was born in Manchester. My mom was born in Shawmut, Alabama, and my dad was born in Mukilteo, Washington. And when my mom was pregnant with me in Manchester, she had a job collecting tickets on the Manchester-Seattle ferry. This was a beach house on Puget Sound. She could see the ferry coming from the front windows of our beach house and would run down the boardwalk to collect tickets when the ferry arrived. That's the sort of family. 3/4 of them were Norwegian, related to my dad's family. And the origin of my name is kind of strange. My dad was full-blooded Norwegian. And my grandfather was born in Tønsberg, Norway, and his name was Christopher Ole with an umlaut over the O, Olhole. And when he was immigrating in the immigration line, one of the guards told him, you have to put your last name first, and there was not so many spaces on that form. So the name was Hole, Christ. And that's the guard said, "Holy Christ, you can't have a name like Holy Christ. Get out of line and change your name." So my grandfather couldn't speak English, and he changed with the help of the guy in front of him who was Norwegian that could speak English. He changed the name he dropped the umlaut and changed the name to Holl. So it's a kind of Kafka-esque bureaucratic beginning of a name. That was after Manchester. We moved to 2021 13th Street, Bremerton, Washington. And that house is still there. You can see it. And that's where I spent, 1952 until I graduated from high school. And that to me was a big house. But when I look at it now, I can hardly believe that's where I grew up. My dad started a company called Service Heating and Sheet Metal, where I worked when I became 14. And my mom worked in the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. In the back of that house was a bank of dirt. And my brother, who's 2 years younger than me, and I would play a game we called Property. We would dig in the dirt. We would make little buildings and roads. We had some toy cars. And we got so excited about that work of making that we would go out there before breakfast, and my mom would, in the summertime, my mom would call us back in for breakfast. And as we got older, we built 3 different tree houses and clubhouses. One was a 2-story tree house. One was a clubhouse underground that was covered with an old rug on logs and dirt. And years later, when I was teaching at Columbia University, I used to say to the first-year students, there's 4 kinds of architecture: under the ground, in the ground, on the ground, and over the ground. And I realized that I had these ideas when I was kind of 10 years old back in 1955. We always drew. And In fact, when my dad was still alive in 2014, we had an exhibition called Hall's Drawing. Andrew McNair helped make the catalog, and you can see that's my dad's drawing on the cover of the poster there. So he could draw, and he loved to draw. And I think, you know, when you're a child and your father draws and your brother draws, that's part of our life. In fact, when I was 13, I entered my oil painting. I had an oil painting set given to me by my parents, and they set me up in the basement so I could paint because it smelled, the oil paint smelled. And the only place I could take this in that little town of 30,000 people was the Kitsap County Fair that happened every August. And at the Kitsap County Fair, you could get an award for the largest pumpkin, the best cow, the finest goat. And they also had a section for painting. And I won 2 blue ribbons. And I think that really encouraged me to be an artist. And that was the main building in the town. Puget Sound Naval Shipyard had this hammerhead crane, and you could see it from everywhere. In fact, the Bremerton Sun newspaper had it on the masthead as the image of the town. And that has a kind of 4-story building as a counterweight. It was for lifting superstructures on to aircraft carriers under construction and dry docks. And I think somehow that image got into my work, my later work. My dad's sheet metal shop was a place where I worked from 14 until 17. And I could do duct work, working with 24 gauge, 28 gauge galvanized. And after hours, I would make sheet metal sculpture. And I think I made this in 1963, and I still have it. But my dad was a tough boss. We had to dig oil tank holes for 300-gallon oil tanks for every residential house. The holes were 4 feet wide, 6 feet long, and 6 feet deep. And sometimes there was hard pan dirt there, and we had to use a pick to get down. But one day I had a really soft soil, and I dug the whole hole by 11:30. My dad stopped by and stopped by and stood over the hole. I was standing in the bottom, and I said, "Look, I'm finished." And my dad said, "Good, you can dig another one after lunch." That's the kind of boss he was. But they were great parents. They would do whatever my brother and I wanted to do. So we convinced them to drive the whole California coast and take us to go surfing. In fact, we convinced them to buy a 1963 Grand Prix Pontiac 2-door hardtop. And all the way down, we're playing the Beach Boys, Surf City, and other kinds of music like that. On that trip, I remember stopping on Highway 1, Big Sur, and we stopped at a restaurant called Nepenthe, and it was built it's still there. It was built in 1949 by Rowan Maiden, who was a intern of Frank Lloyd Wright. So I was very inspired by the angled roof and the redwood construction, and I think probably it was my first experience in architecture. And I grew up, like every kid in Bremerton, with hot rod cars. And here's my dad with and that's labeled wrong, 1939 Chevrolet Coupe, which I built behind the garage when I was 15. And the day I turned 16, December 9th, I drove that out from behind the garage, December 9th, 1963. And after that, I traded it for a 1931 Model A Ford with a 283 V8 Chevrolet engine. There were only 4 bolts holding the body onto the frame. The day I drove that to the house, my mom cried. And in fact, you can see 2021 13th Street on the left photograph in the back there, that little green house. And I left the engine running, and it rattled all the windows in the house. So I put it for sale, and in a few days, I sold it to 5 sailors. Bremerton was a military town, and when the ships were in, the sailors would run the town. I played pulling guard on the football team in high school, and this is called the West High Wildcats, and this is the awards at the end of the year. I got the Inspirational Award, And if you can see on the lower right, I had a broken left arm. I broke my left arm in about the third game, but I still managed to get the inspirational award. When I got to the University of Washington, I went directly into the University of Washington. I never had second thoughts. I wanted to go into architecture. I really, in a way, I was inspired by only one professor, and it was Professor Herman Punt. And he gave lectures he gave a kind of theory course where he took you through the history of what he said is, this is the history of modern architecture. It begins with Brunelleschi. It begins in Florence with the Duomo. Why? Because here the construction has a tension ring. And he said, that's the beginning of modern architecture. And then he took us from there, he took us to Schinkel in Berlin and all the way through Schinkel's work. And then he took us to Louis Sullivan and the Chicago School, every building of Louis Sullivan. There was a Macintosh lecture on the Glasgow School of Art. And then he went to Frank Lloyd Wright, and the last sort of 10 lectures were all the work of Frank Lloyd Wright. And I remember the end, and that was it. And when I graduated, I never had any information on Le Corbusier or anybody else. That was his idea of what is modern architecture. But I had a professor in landscape that really was inspiring, Richard Haig. I remember he gave this lesson with blue books, and he told everybody to write what you do before you start to do your landscape design. And you could write, 500 words. And one guy wrote 3 words, and he showed it to the whole class. He said, this. He was a very Zen instructor. Rome was amazing. That's where I think I.
Sorry, Steven, I think we lost you for a couple of seconds. You can repeat that with your professor, De Hack.
Oh, his word was, as a landscape architect, you must be the site. Rome was amazing. That was a very important moment in my life. And I remember Herman Punt encouraging me to go to Rome. It was the first program of the University of Washington. I'd never been to Europe. And he gave me, in my mailbox, he gave me a Goethe quote. Rome is a city where one can spend a lifetime in Pythagorean silence and still not know it. And I said, I have to go to Rome. So there, Oscar Zarina was the only teacher, and she arranged for Ed Weinstein and myself to have this little apartment, Via Denari. It's still there, Via Denari 6 in Rome. And it had no windows. It was at the bottom of a light well. So you could, if you wanted to see what the day was, you had to look up this shaft of a light well. But it was right behind the Pantheon. So every day I would go, and I had an agreement with the guard there. And I said, I'm a student, please, can I come in before the tourists? So he would let me in, and I would then check and analyze and look at how the light would change. Every day of the year, it's different. And as the seasons change, how that angle of the sun changes. It's a fantastic, actually, I've been going back to the Pantheon almost once a year ever since. Oscar Zarina was an amazing teacher. Born in Riga, Latvia in 1929. She spoke 8 languages. She would go to the Vatican and translate the Pope's message on Sunday into Latvian and Lithuanian. But for me, as a teacher, she was very strict. She said, if you want to be an architect, first, you must learn to cook. So that's what I had to do. I cooked in her kitchen. I learned how to make spaghetti alla carbonara. I learned how to stir a wooden bowl, a wooden spoon with egg whites and salt and olive oil to make mayonnaise. So it was a kind of, it was an education via Oscar Zarina. And when I returned to America, it was the height of the Vietnam War. And I had been drafted back in December of 1969, they had the first lottery for people that would have to go into the service, no questions asked. So they said the first 150 numbers will have to go. And, you know, that's your birth date. Out of 365, I drew number 47. And then at that time, I just closed my desk and I said, okay, I know what I have to do. And I began to write conscientious objection, 18 pages of text on philosophical grounds. Now, for those of you who know about the CO, the conscientious objector status, they don't accept anything other than religious grounds. But I filed this thing over and over to the draft board in Bremerton, Washington, which was a military town. I think I sent it registered mail over 10 times. And finally, in about 1971, actually, it came back with no letter, just a draft card that said 4F, which is a physical deferment. And I never had a physical. And I said to my friends, I'm not going to accept this. I want my philosophical grounds conscientious objection. And my friends said, hey, accept it. They think you're crazy. That's a 4F. And for my last project at the University of Washington, my professor accepted my participation in this largest demonstration against the Vietnam War. There were 150,000 people in San Francisco. I hitchhiked from Seattle to San Francisco to be in the demonstration. And there were something like 500,000 in Washington, D.C. It was the largest ever demonstration opposing an American war. And I must say that to this day, I feel strongly that this courage to protest is important. And at that time, and I still feel at that time, it had it's what changed the direction of America at that time. So I was very fortunate to participate. And here we started a bookstore, William Stout Architecture Books. That's me behind the lamp there with the beard. And Bill Stout still has the bookstore in San Francisco. We started a little magazine, Pamphlet Architecture, and that was the first issue. Bridges, you can see San Francisco, ... New York. I had just arrived in New York. I came to New York on New Year's Eve, 1976, 1977, on an excursion ticket. And I only knew one person in New York, my brother. And I met him at the base of the Chrysler Building because I didn't know anything about the city. And he grabbed my other suitcase and we went off to a loft party in the Soho. And like immediately I was into New York City and it was absolutely amazing. And the art scene. And I remember I met Andrew McNair at the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies. And it was a really cold winter. And I didn't have any money. And I had an army coat on. In fact, that's the army coat there in that photograph. And he said, dress in layers. That's how you can stay warm. So I went down and bought another army coat. And I wore that on top of this army coat. And this is on the High Line in 1979. You could sneak up there and walk around. And that's when I proposed the Bridge of Houses project. I don't think that's in here. We took that slide out. Anyway, that project from 1979, 1980, the model is in the Museum of Modern Art collection. And I'm very excited that the High Line exists. In fact, my office is at one end of it and I live near the other end of it so I can walk to work on the High Line, in better days. And this is a place I lived at 655 6th Avenue in an old department store. I had a cubic loft that was my office as well. And there you can see, you could come into the office where that zigzag stair is. There's a big door there. And you wouldn't know that I lived on that shelf above the entrance. I went to the YMCA at the end of the day at 6 o'clock to shower. And there was no hot water in that space. But it was all right. It was dedication to trying to start in architecture. And I always have taught. This was a teaching stint. I went back to the University of Washington in 1979. So you can see Oster Zarina, second from the left, Ed Weinstein, my colleague from Rome, Rem Koolhaas in the middle, Rem with hair, Folke Nyberg, and there's me, kind of cross-legged. And anyway, I've taught my whole life at different schools, Pratt, Parsons, Syracuse, and since 1982, Columbia University. This is a very important moment, in my life. I started with, a kind of a philosophy that began grounded in architecture, in morphology and typology. And I worked with it for a few years, and I felt it was a dead end. And I was on a train, a transcontinental train trip in 1984 from Toronto to Banff. And that's a transcontinental train that has to negotiate an elevation change in the mountains. And there's a thing called the spiral tunnel. And this is me giving a lecture describing what happened. But during that trip, I sat next to a professor of philosophy who talked to me about Merleau-Ponty and phenomenology for the whole trip. So in the end, I thought that's the direction I need to take. And I felt like I went into this spiral tunnel, kind of rationalist typologist, and came out a phenomenologist. And many times we were in competition with one another. Here's Tom Main, Michael Rotundi, and myself for the Berlin Library Competition, 1988. We're on the steps of the Schinkel's Altes Museum. And it's a project that was very dear to my heart, and it was taken away from me. After we won it, the building senator in Berlin came and basically, it's a long story, took it away by running another round in which I wouldn't win. However, this is a little out of sequence. My first wife was an art assistant to James Turrell. So we made many of James Turrell's light space models in my shop on Hudson Street. And this is Philip Johnson calling me up and saying, I want you to join me and go to Berlin. Can you do it? And I said, oh, well, yeah. I mean, what's the story? He says, I'll tell you on the plane. And then he said, be at the Concorde at 9:30 in the morning. I've never been on the Concorde. And anyway, I went out to the airport, got on the Concorde, flew to Berlin. And then this is Philip and me and Fritz Neumeier in Berlin in 1992. He wanted me to do a project there because he was angry that they pushed me out of the Berlin Library Competition. And he had a commission which never came through, but he was going to give me a little piece of it in front of his building. Anyway, nothing ever happened from that, but I've always collaborated with artists, and this is where I kind of drop off, because I'm going to skip from 1993 all the way to today, because I'm running out of time. I see I'm running short, right? I'm running short of time. But I would just say that I've always loved collaborating with artists, and Vito Acconci was a dear friend of mine, and we did the storefront together in 1993. And I'm very proud of that little tiny project where, in fact, Vito and I were so dedicated to do it that we gave our fee. We had a fee of $5,000 each, and we both donated that to the construction of the building. And I think in 2008, they rebuilt it. It was supposed to be a temporary facade, but they rebuilt it. And all my life, Zaha and I have been parallel to each other. I forgot to tell the story of the AA, where I went to school and was discovered by Elia Zengalis, and we were on the jury that in fact Zaha had just come from Leon Creer's studio, and Rem and I both leaned forward at the same time saying, what a brilliant project this is. And she had drawn it in pink magic marker with arches in it. And we always laughed about the way she began, but she was really came out of nowhere. And then at this point in her life in 1993, this was the Vitra fire station. She detailed everything. This was an amazing moment because finally she got something built. And we, at that point, both Zaha and I never thought that she would get a lot of things built. So the history was very strange and different. In fact, this is the end. This is 2016. I had to skip 23 years. This was taken 2 weeks before Zaha died in my apartment. There's my wife on the right, Dimitra, Io, Helene, Zaha. Zaha came to bring a little Issey Miyake dress for Io, and Tom Ing came that night too. We all went to dinner, and that's just the last year. On the left is Dimitra, my wife, who's also an architect. Little Thevos, who's 9 months old. Thevos Myron Hall, middle name same as my dad. That connects us back to the paratrooper. And Io Helene Hall and me, and that's a sculpture I did at Art Omai. And just to end, I want to say that one of the things that we have been doing together here in Rhinebeck is T-Space, dedicated to poetry, music, painting, sculpture, and architecture. And this is the 10th year of T-Space. This is Ann Carson reading in 2016. We commission music and we commission poetry. And we have a program for architecture students, 6 students every July. So it's a very important part of what I do is continuing teaching. And I just want to end with that slide, which is from the great poet, Robert Kelly, for Dimitra, Io Helene, the builders of minds to come. And if I say that Robert Kelly has read at T-Space 3 different times. And he, in fact, wrote a poem. We commissioned a poem called Phases of the Earth that was the groundbreaking for the Exif In-House. And the first time he read a poem called What I Really Want to Say from 2013. And I'll just read 3 sentences. What I really want to say is about poetry, always. Is about architecture, I mean music, yes. How can I tell them apart? I'll try. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, for the wonderful presentation. You have so many things to say and to explain that I was thinking actually we need a second round, we need a second event for the second part of the story. You said you needed to stop at 1993. Yeah. So it's, as I mentioned before for the audience, it's a huge honor to have you participating. And we don't have much time for the interview, but let me start with the question that is for me the most important one. You have, so with amazing 50 years of practice, 40 years as a professor, and 11 years of the foundation, you have achieved so much. Of all that you have done, what is it that you are the most proud of?
I think you can see that in the last 3 slides, right? The builder of minds to come. I think it's very important to think about the future. And I'm very grateful to have had the chance to do what I've done, but I think we have to think about the future, especially in terms of this planet and what we're going to leave to future generations. So I'm very happy to be thinking about minds to come. And I continue to teach full time right now at Columbia University with Dimitra. Together we teach.
What is that motivates you the most about the future?
The fact that the young people are going to inherit everything that we've done, and we need to reset. I'm writing a text right now called Reset. And I believe that this year of pause is something that causes us to think. I mean, when you have to stop what you're doing and sit and stay in your room or at your desk for a year, it causes you to rethink all the meanings, all the core values. And I think it's a positive, in a way, it's a positive thing for everybody on the planet. We're all in this together. And I think it's time to recalibrate. And I'm working on a text right now. I gave a lecture in Patras, Greece. What was it, 2 weeks ago? That we had a wonderful conversation afterwards about the problem of the pandemic and how do we live and what does it mean to us and what does it mean going forward. And I feel it could be something philosophically valuable.
Sounds very interesting. So you founded your foundation in 2010 with the purpose of uniting architecture, art, poetry, and music of our time, which is super interesting. We have one question from the audience, and this one question from one of our previous speakers. So I'm going to play a video for you, okay?
Okay.
Hi, Stephen Orr. My name is François Valentini, architect from Luxembourg. Since I was a young architect in the 80s, I was so impressed about your work. And over the years, I discovered that we have the similar way of working. As you, I love arts, I love to draw, and I created my own foundation. We promote the young artists from different fields. So my question is, what's your game? What you can learn from the arts? Maybe it's better I invite you at my place, which is in the middle of the vineyards, and we can discuss this topic with a good glass of wine. Much deeper and much more relaxed.
Yes, I take that invitation. Sounds good. But I learned from my daughter, for example, you know, she's 5 years old and she's obsessed with dinosaurs and she can name them. She has models, scale models of 48 dinosaurs, and she can name every one of the 48 dinosaurs. And they're from different periods, 66 million years ago, 150 million years ago. So I think when you think about the moment we exist today, this pause, maybe we need a big picture to look at a larger frame of time.
I would like, actually, that was one of our questions for you. So if having kids has changed you, and if so, how?
Yeah, I just answered it. It does.
Yeah, that's why.
Because the questions that you might have to answer start to question deeper things that aren't, let's say, necessarily at the front of your mind. So I think the problem with an architectural practice is it puts a lot of garbage in your face, contracts and clients and things that are not necessarily philosophical at all. And it can fill up all your mind and all your time. So this is why I love to teach, because when we're in our studio, we're asking philosophical questions, deeper questions about core meanings and values. And I think that's very important. And I think the young people just naturally, intuitively ask those questions.
Stephen, that sounds super interesting. And we have many more questions also there. We've seen many questions coming from the audience, but maybe we can continue during the roundtable discussion. If it's okay for you, we go ahead with Liz. And after that, we have a conversation together. Okay?
Good.
Thank you, Stephen, for the nice presentation. We really enjoyed it. Thank you a lot.
Thank you.